and going, you can always go there too. But if you don't mind leaving us your email because you're interested in the program, I mean, Jake has done a great job. We have 5 major topics and 5 major speakers, and we're going to get them all in one semester, which is remarkable to have these folks coming in. So, but you can keep getting updates on those. So if you don't mind just giving us your name and email, that's cool. If you gave it to us last time, we don't need it again. Second thing, kind of practically speaking, is we came back to Leo's. We were here last time and realized that it's Monday night football night, and especially you guys in the back row there, they get louder if there's something good going on. We did turn this TV off, but if all of a sudden all of you are looking in the other direction, I'll get that something is... But if you can't hear me, please let me know. I'm going to use my big boy pastor voice and see if we can be good and heard here. I don't know that when we get to our salon, which is the first of the 3 gatherings, that we'll actually be here, because this is a little loud, and it's okay for our practice runs. These are the trial runs. But when we kind of get into it, and when Tina is here, it might be more polite if she had a little better venue for presenting her ideas. But as you know, or maybe you don't know, we don't want to have it in the church or in the university. Pubs are really important to the grant. That's part of what our inspiring was, not just so that people get drink while they do this, but the idea of it being more a communal spot where, where there is fellowship gathered around in a very playful way. But really, you know, I'll give you, Martin Luther did his best theology in a pub. That's the rumor. And I don't know whether that's historical or not, but the idea is that this is a festive place, but a great place to exchange ideas. And so we're going to try to stay with the pub, but we still haven't, it may not be here when the time comes, because I don't think this will ever be quiet. And so if you have better suggestions, we're always kind of open to that. And then the third thing I want to say before I kind of jump in here with my remarks is just the idea of the salon. This is what we're calling the first session each time, and really the idea is that someone will present some ideas. It's me tonight, and Tina will be our first official salon, but we really want to get you talking around these tables. The idea is to generate conversation, and from those conversations to the title of the grant is Cultivating Questions. So the idea is that from these tables, we bring these questions that will eventually send to Mr. Gingrich. He'll get all of our conversations about the topic, and then we'll ask him to really focus his remarks to respond to us there. So the idea each salon night will be, the presenter will talk. I'm going to give you about 20 minutes. I've only got about an hour and 2 hours worth of material here, so you'll have to slow me down maybe, but 20 minutes to get you then talking. And the idea is about learning kind of from each other, and especially with the ideas of science and faith, which is sort of new for some people, and maybe even unredeemable in terms of those conversations. But the idea is to kind of put the ball into your court. So tonight I'm going to just do a little bit. Jake said something about where science and faith have collided. I think Jake did a great job last time of talking about I think, maybe this is my reading of what you were talking about, of the spirituality of scientists. That scientists are not aspiritual. In fact, Darwin himself, and we use Darwin kind of as our model, and so it was that there is a spirituality inherent in, or maybe not inherent, but in many scientists, and we need to know that. I thought I would flip that around and say there's a really great intellectual tradition in people of faith, and I want to look at some of that for the good and the bad of how we respond to the intellectual tradition. And tonight I want to posit about 5 ideas in your brains to think about this intellectual tradition for the good and the bad of it, and then invite you to do some thinking about the intellectual tradition in terms of spirituality. So I'd like to start by taking you to some old rabbinic mythology to lay the groundwork for thinking about thinking. And this really is some old stuff, and I want to teach you about Midrash. In fact, I'm going to ask you to do Midrash tonight. Midrash is a Hebrew word that comes from the Hebrew word drash, which means to inquire and to systematically inquire. And there's a couple of pieces of quick stories I want to tell. So the rabbis say that when you are studying the Torah, which is the sacred book of Judaism, and traditionally it's done in scrolls, and it's beautifully hand-carved, when you look at a scroll, the truth of Torah is not found in the black ink. The rabbis say the truth of Torah is actually found in the white light that shines from the page. And the black ink is there to help you see the truth. And so the idea is that the words themselves are not truth, but the words point to a deeper truth. And therefore, in order to figure out what that truth is, it must be found in conversation. And that is called midrash. The other piece of mythology I want to tell you is that the Hebrews believed that when God revealed God's self to the Hebrew people, God spoke a couple of the laws in Torah, but when God spoke, the people got so scared that they really didn't want to hear from God in this revelation. What they really wanted to do is they wanted to hear the truth from other people, and so the truth really was an oral, living thing, and it was not committed to paper. Jews never really believed that the scrolls represented truth. The truth really comes in the conversation about the scrolls, and that's called midrash. And so, Jews have tried to find their understanding of the world, not necessarily in any codified sense, but in conversation, in a systematic inquiry, which sounds kind of like the scientific method to me. So out of the blocks, there is a sense that in order to understand truth, any kind of truth, it must be done scientifically through inquiry. So how this kind of works is, if you are hanging out with a bunch of rabbis, and rabbi means teacher, it's literally an exercise in education, and Jews take great pride in their education system. The idea is that somebody in the group posits an idea, and then that idea is handled by the community, and we dicker about it. We bring our own experience, we bring the tradition, we bring new logic and reason, and we debate this idea until something lifts up that resembles the truth. And to me, when living in an age where it often feels like science and faith collide, that sounds to me like what's done. It's like a laboratory for truth. And so that's some of the oldest idea of how truth is revealed in spirituality, especially, and I must confess, tonight I'm going to talk mainly about the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. I mean, Buddhists and Hindus have some wonderful intellectual history too, but can't do everything in one night. So I want to start you with midrash and the idea that truth is a conversation and a living thing, and it's often handled orally. And it is something living, so it's not behind us, it's not set in stone, it's something that we are constantly seeking. This is an old Jewish idea. So jumping you ahead to the idea of Jesus' life, Jesus was participated in midrash all the time. The stories that are told of him, if you know these stories in any way, he will often be debating with lawyers and the doctors, the Pharisees, the people around him. And those conversations, we talk about them now as disputes, like, you know, people were pissed off and fighting with each other, when actually they were seeking truth collectively. So there's a great story in the gospel about Jesus who says, that a lawyer comes to him and says, you know, what's the greatest commandment? And Jesus tells him something from Scripture. He quotes a Scripture, and then he says, yes, but I don't understand this. And he says, well, then who, you know, and they're talking about, he said, you should love your neighbor. And the guy says, well, who is my neighbor? This is midrash. And then Jesus goes on, not at that point to actually refer, but to actually tell a new story, which becomes the Good Samaritan story. But that's actually a pursuit of midrash. And so setting all of what I want to say in this context of that the tradition, at least in the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, is of a living piece of truth. Now, why doesn't it continue that way? I want to take you later in the game and give you another point of history. And I want to take you to about the 4th century, when Christianity has become the official state religion of Rome at this point. And for very political reasons, at least this is, I'm giving you my reading of the story, the emperor says, you can't have these conversations where truth is loosey-goosey. You can't do it. We need to get this codified, because if everybody's going to fall in line behind me as the emperor, I need this better, more organized. You can't have a variety of versions of Christianity out there. You need to decide on one. And there's a man named Vincent of Vincennes who creates what's called the Vincentian Code in the 4th century. And this basically says there is a truth and we all believe it. And that happens in about the 4th century. And he goes on to say, and I'll read you just a clip of what he says, and I'm going to read it in English. Now in the Catholic Church, and remember that's the regal religion of Rome now, itself we take the greatest care to hold that which has been believed everywhere, always, and by all people. So he makes the claim in the 4th century that there is this spot. No longer is this up for debate, here it is. And in essence, I think what happens at this point is the church says you can't ask questions anymore, you can't debate the truth, and in fact, we'll tell you what the truth is. And this is a huge kind of intellectual shift in the 4th century, which says no more question asking. And they create, at this point, the Roman Catholic Church, any good Catholics in the room know, it's called the Magisterium, and this is the collection of all the gathered truth up to this point, and you appeal to that. That will be the truth henceforward. And so at that point, the intellectual tradition takes a pretty serious hit. The idea of seeking truth collectively, no, there is a moment of truth out there in the world, and we are going to, we've got it. Such to the point that they began at this point, this is when creeds enter in, meaning we'll tell you what the truth is in a statement. Here's when the canon comes in, and the canon is, we'll tell you what books you can read and what books you can't read. That's called the canon. And then the development of the clergy. They didn't want just anybody messing with the truth. Not anybody can play with it, so we'll train the people who will know what the truth is. And so it was a great way of organizing and very politically astute of the emperor, but it really, intellectual pursuit of the truth at this time takes a big hit. And the church for the next, from about the 4th century to about the next 1,000 years, although there are some great intellectual moments in the life of the Christian church, it goes underground. It's not part of the official teaching of the church. All right, so we've got Midrash, we've got the Vincentian Code I want you to know about, and now I want you to meet Baruch Spinoza, who really sets the world on its ear in the 16th century. He is a Jewish philosopher who is trained as a young boy as a rabbi. Much like Darwin, Spinoza he sort of represents, for a lot of people, he's the first atheist. And that actually really isn't so. He's quite an intellectual pursuer of truth, and his idea, he's trained as a rabbi, but he starts asking questions that are out of bounds. And people that he eventually is excommunicated, if you can believe it or not, from the Jewish church. It's called, there's a great Hebrew word, I can't remember off the top of my head. But when he's 22 years old, he's been in training, but he asks the wrong questions, and they tell him that he's getting too smart for his own good, and the church doesn't want him anymore. And basically, he begins to write on his own then. He's very informed by the philosophies of Hume and Descartes, rationalism. He wants to understand God, and he adds to the conversation now the idea that God should be coherent. So, if I'm going to pursue this should make sense. And so, Spinoza really introduces the idea that God has a sense, there's a sense of real truth that can be found in this, but we should pursue it with good questions, and we should understand. And if you don't understand, then it can't be of God. This is the logic that Spinoza enters. And so he really creates two what I would consider really interesting ideas that he really moves along and are born here. One is the idea of God in nature, and the idea that he looks at the natural world, working with some scientists. They begin to look more carefully, and he really equates the natural world with God at that point, and gives us the introduction of things like deism and pantheism, which are kind of new ideas about how to define God, and takes that into the realm of the philosophical and away from the life of the church. He also attacks the idea that we should put all our eggs in the Scripture basket. And he said, let's be reasonable about Scripture. We should look more carefully. In fact, criticism of other ancient literature has been around for a while, and he's the first one to begin to apply criticism to Scripture. In fact, he's the first one. He asked the question of his rabbi, and this is where he gets in trouble. Moses couldn't possibly have written the Pentateuch. And he argues from logic that this is so, and there are still Jews today who believe that Moses wrote it, but he argues that that's impossible, and he has this beautiful laid out rational argument about why it's not so, and they say you can't talk like that. And he part of this movement towards the Enlightenment is one of the first to introduce back into the church the idea that, and Christians really kind of pick up the banner here, and the idea in Germany during the Enlightenment, lots of priests began to do kind of intellectual work around God and around Scripture. And so it's sort of like the push and pull. Here's Midrash, here's the Vincentian Code. Oh, maybe again with the Enlightenment there's going to be new questions asked, and we're going to open ourselves up and see where we can go with this. And so, I mean, through this period, this is where, I mean, if you know your church history, we have the Christian church has the Reformation now, and it explodes with all kinds of new ideas. Judaism takes a couple of different divergent paths at this point, looking to new ideas and new understandings. And even at this point, we get some work being done in Islam with kind of a critical sense. Islam has a wonderful intellectual period at this point. Unfortunately, it goes underground very quickly. Christianity and Judaism, there are intellectual streams that continue, but not in Islam. So it is this Enlightenment period that leads to things like you talked about last time with Darwin, and the idea of new ideas and how we can use these new ideas to try to understand the world more richly, and to try to bring together a conversation between the natural world and between faith. And Darwin is one of those people. But just when you think, okay, maybe we're making some headway, the push comes back again. And the pushback happens in the United States, and this is my fourth spot where I want to take you to. And this is sort of the birth of what we know today as fundamentalism, which is an idea, again, of a very codified sense of what the truth is. And it begins, of all places, at Princeton Theological Seminary, which, just so you know, is today the most liberal seminary in the United States, but not in 1865. Charles Hodge is there, and he says, this Darwin guy, and he's responding directly. This is how Darwin becomes kind of the Antichrist to Christians. He says, listen, science is taking us away from the truth, and that can't be. And so he begins to create this sense of a unified truth. And this is my favorite quote that I found yesterday well, I hope you love it as much as I do. When asked about his teaching at Princeton, he boasts, after 50 years, a new idea was never originated in this seminary. But I want you to stay with the idea of the nature of thinking about thinking. Is this about new ideas, and this is the push and pull that we find. Now what happens is Hodge's ideas begin to spread, and we have a group. There's a big. He generates what he calls himself the Third Great Awakening, which brings together more conservative Christian scholars, and they create what are called the 5 fundamentals. And these are principles within Christianity that say, if you don't believe this, you're not a Christian. Now, I just want to add as a little aside, because it makes me laugh, is those 5 fundamentals have changed several times over the last 100 years, but the idea is basically there is, again, a sense of truth, and you must adhere to this truth, and there's going to be no straying from this. And so the idea of the clash of science really, I mean, Hodge is the first one to posit the inerrancy of Scripture. Although he claims people have believed it forever, it's not really a doctrine or an idea anywhere until about 1875. That's the first time somebody argues that Christian Scripture should never be touched. It is inerrant. The idea that every word, if God intended it that way, that's the way it is, and nothing should ever be changed. That belief, he says that's the way people have always believed it. I don't see that in the reading of history. I think he really is moving to kind of create this kind of an idea. And as you know, I mean, many of you, if you grew up in the Christian church, had a thing called a catechism. And this is an idea where you can ask questions, but they have to be our questions. And by the way, we'll give you the answers too. So if you know what a catechism is, here's the correct question to ask, and here's the correct answer. That's a long way from Midrash. I mean, that just shows you the poles with which faith but it hasn't always been that way. I guess that's my ongoing point. All right, so the last spot that I'd like to just talk about is bringing you into this century, and I want to talk about what some philosophers and spiritual people are calling integral spirituality. And I had my first taste of this when I was 12, and some of you have heard this story before, but I think it shows where you are. I was sitting in a junior high classroom right in front of Lori Pally. I went to the Congregational Church. Lori Pally was Jewish. She was also wicked cute, and I had a crush on her. And she lived 2 blocks over on Flag Street, and I lived on Grove Street, because the Jewish neighborhood was Flag Street, and I lived in the Protestant neighborhood, and this was in the 60s, a while back. And I remember going home and explaining to my dad that I thought Lori Pally was really cute, and somehow it came up that she lived on Flag Street. He asked me if she was Jewish. I said she was, and he said, it's too bad she's going to hell, which was my father's response to that. Now, I, at that moment, being the precocious 12 or 13-year-old that I was, knew that my father was wrong about that. And so I said, let's talk some more about this. I want to inquire about something which transcends the sense of the division between traditions. And that began a journey for me that I'm still on in terms of trying to understand a myriad of traditions and how they come together. What's happened in the last 10 or 15 years is I realized that I'm not the only one on this journey, that there are a lot of people. I study at a place in Chicago called the Shem Center, which is a place for interfaith spirituality. But ultimately, a lot of the philosophers, and Ken Wilber is one of my favorites, who talks about, again, having a sense of spirituality that transcends both specific traditions and also includes the idea of scientific discovery and knowledge. And these integral, if we are to find truth, either spiritually or scientifically, those all have to go together. And these movements, and there are a lot of little ones all over the place that we don't know much about, but they're happening, are called integral spirituality. And I'm fascinated by the growth of that, wondering where we're going to go next. And I think things like this kind of help us on our way. All right, so I've been yakking for a long time. What I'd like you to do is, I'd like to invite you to do midrash at your tables. Get another drink if you need to. And at your tables, what I'd like you to do is pick any idea, any spot that we've just talked about, and either speak for it or against it. Make a statement about what you've just heard. I think this is a terrible thing, or I think this is a wonderful thing, or I'm interested in this, or I'm not interested in that. and then let the table respond. I'd like to hear your thoughts about the history of kind of some of the things I've laid out, but where you would put yourself in terms of a thinking faith, or in terms of a spiritual science, or how you bring those two things together. And I'm going to let you do a little talking about that, and then we'll do that for about 20 minutes, and then we'd like to have a little bigger conversation. Okay? All right, please have at it at your tables.
I got a question.
All right.